welcome to the Amberdata podcast. I'm Chris Martin, joined with the research team, Pat Doyle and Christian Manaog. How's everything going today, guys?
Good, thanks, Chris. Yeah, awesome.
Christian, can you tell us what is the difference between Uniswap v2 and Uniswap v3?
Yeah, so Uniswap v2 is the first, I'd say, big iteration of a DEX that sort of commanded attention in the crypto world. So Uniswap v2 sort of paved the way for all of these other DEXs to come onto the scene. If there was a big controversy with SushiSwap, and stuff like that, where they just copied the Uniswap v2 code, like line for line. But the idea was that, the Uniswap v2 was the first DEX. And then the Uniswap team was like, well, there's some problems with v2, so we're going to make a new version called v3. And I would say the biggest difference between the two is that in v2, it uses this constant product formula to calculate how much token A should be worth for token B. And that's just this linear line that can only change when you mint or burn. Or add liquidity or remove liquidity from a pool. In Uniswap v3, they sort of address this problem by creating these concentrated liquidity ranges, so that if you put liquidity into a Uniswap v3 pool, you're actually defining the range in which you want your liquidity to be traded. And this is nice because, sometimes if you put money into a Uniswap v2 pool, you could be inefficient in the way that let's say the market moves, because crypto moves hundreds of dollars at a time. The price could be very far from what you want your crypto to trade at, and then your fees would also be reduced in turn. And so v3 sort of addresses this problem for LPers, and it makes it more convenient. But on the flip side, it also makes it a little bit more complicated, because now we have these token ranges, and it's a little hard to sort of know exactly what's going on.
So there should be an advantage in Uniswap v3 for both LPs who can specify their token price ranges for liquidity, and for swappers, because when there's higher liquidity in a given range, they should face less slippage. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And it I think in theory it's supposed to help a little bit more with impermanent loss, but we can talk about that more.
What are we thinking for Uniswap v4?
One of the differences there's a lot of differences really in v3 and v4. Primarily, it still has the concept of this liquidity range, but in Uniswap v3, when you create a new pool, your liquidity and your tick spacing for the ranges where you can provide liquidity is determined by the fee parameter. So that was one thing that the user creating a pool kind of lost control of. V4 allows the users to essentially dictate what they want their liquidity range ticks to be. But the big innovation, the big thing that people are excited about in V4 is this idea of Uniswap hooks. So Uniswap hooks basically are the idea, there's basically 4 actions that before or after something occurs in Uniswap, you can actually write code to add additional functionality. So you can add functionality before or after a pool is created, before and after a position is modified, before or after a swap occurs, and then before or after a donation is made, which is essentially giving fees to LPs in a pool. And so different examples of this, and again, this can be customized per pool, but one of the things you could essentially do is create, rather than having a 24/7 liquidity pool, you can actually make a hook that checks before a swap occurs. It does the swap occur within, X hour, between X and Y hours. You can do other things like, social game pools where you're do you own this asset? And you can trade assets within a pool. So it'll check, do you have the balance of, a specific NFT or another token. So you can really get like super creative. The other one that is really interesting is kind of on the broader ranges of liquidity, kind of on the long tails, is using those liquidity ranges in another protocol to lend out. So it's not just sitting there passively in the pool, but actually being lent out on Aave or another protocol, for example. So it'll be really interesting to see kind of the development on the V4 side, but I think really the tick spacing range is just a a bit more control to the user. And then where it really will get interesting is how people implement these different hooks. Layered complexity of things is always added risk. Now you're not just, isolated to the Uniswap v4 risk, but it could be, in the example of Aave, it's Aave and Uniswap v4 risk. But theoretically, you're exposing, passive assets to a more yielding area while they're not like in a tradable range. And so I think that it's more capital efficient for LPs. We're on different different ranges of the liquidity pool.
I'm curious to think through the token gating aspect of it too, right? That's a huge change. That means like you could have a Bored Ape Yacht Club, WETH USDC pool, and a Mutant Ape Yacht Club WETH USDC pool separately, right?
Exactly. And then, you could take it a step further outside of that. Even, if you look at traditional finance being comfortable to operate in on-chain context, you could have whitelisted addresses that can swap within a USDC WETH pool, that can only swap within that pool. And so who your counterparties are at certain tick ranges. And so now you can really control like access into the pool. Now it's not as open as it would be, but realistically, these things exist in other protocols as well. So it's something, it's just an extension of what would come anyway. So I think it is a net positive, and I think it'll be really interesting. And I think there's a lot of really creative ways you can like use these hooks.
And that could be a use case for decentralized identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the main topic is on impermanent loss. What exactly is impermanent loss, Christian? Like, why is this important? Is it actually even important?
Yeah, so impermanent loss, you care about it if you're a liquidity provider, right? And the basic idea is that, is it more profitable for me to just hold my coins, or is it more profitable to provide liquidity to a pool, right? And that decision comes down to this concept of impermanent loss, because when you put tokens into a pool, the price of that token may change while you don't have access to your tokens, right? Because your tokens are in a pool, and during Unity 3, right, you don't get like any sort of like liquidity token that you can use for yield somewhere else, maybe, because that's how Blue works. And so while you're stuck being a liquidity provider, the price of a token can change, and now suddenly like it would have made more sense if you just held your ETH when it went from 1,000 to 2,000, then putting it in at the 1,000 range, and then seeing it being traded there or like not being traded at all as the concentrated liquidity moves, right? And so figuring out your permanent loss is really important, because if you can figure it out, it lets you make a decision on whether you want to pull out of a liquidity pool, if it's profitable to stay in it. And the way you get profit is by having that pool be very active, right? If there's active trading, then you collect fees, and in theory, your fees should be greater than your impermanent loss. That's how you end up ahead, right? And so it's a really hard problem, because as we all know, the crypto data ecosystem is pretty opaque, and it's like not very obvious whether you're in profit or not. So yeah, impermanent loss in general is just it's a very hard problem that like I'd say very few people give you access to understand. But I guess now we have this endpoint which you can use, and it's super cool. And I guess that's what we're going to talk about next, right?
Then impermanent loss is sort of your opportunity cost, in a way.
Something like that. Yeah. I think it's not wrong to call it an opportunity cost, because the reason why it's impermanent is because it's not a loss until you withdraw at a loss, right? Because in theory, let's say you put your money in, it waits around for like, let's say you take on some impermanent loss, right? Like the price goes up for like a day, and now you're like $1,000, or it's like 100% impermanent loss, but then it comes back down to the price you put it in like a week later, right? So if you withdraw a week later, you actually didn't maintain any loss at all, right? So, there's this weird decision point where you have to decide between like, oh, like, is this IL too much for me? Like, should I withdraw now and take this loss at this rate? Or should I wait a bit and see if my IL will come down? And, all the time thinking about how many fees you've gotten so far, because that also is a factor of whether you should pull out or not.
One way that we can think about this, or how we should approach it on the podcast, is like, let's talk about different types of pools. So you have 3 different pools that we're looking at. We're looking at USDC, USDT. We're looking at wrapped Bitcoin, WBTC, and WETH, and we're looking at Pepe WETH, right? So these 3 pools are our stablecoin pools, which in general, the price of these pools shouldn't change too much. We also have a higher liquidity pool. Wrapped Bitcoin has high liquidity, wrapped ETH, high liquidity, with 2 pairs that have been well established. And there's a number of these pools out there. And then we have our altcoin/meme coin pool. Pepe was the hot token for a few months, and it's still an ongoing meme. So the impermanent loss between all of these 3 should change significantly, right? So yeah, let's talk about stablecoin pools. Because of the fact that stablecoin pools maintain their price fairly closely together, we should see less impermanent loss in general, right? What is the strategy for LPing in Uniswap v3 on a stablecoin pool? Is there a strategy? What are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think from like an impermanent loss perspective, like the impermanent loss risk is relatively low. So then to me, it becomes like a lower risk fee generating pool. So depending on your tick spacing and the range that you're interested in, I mean, you've seen stablecoins lose peg, obviously, but the volatility of stablecoins is pretty close to $1 all the time. So if it's just swapping between USDC to Tether based on some protocols requirements, then it just purely becomes an easier or passive way to generate fees on a specific pool. Not to say you can't incur impermanent loss, but like the impact is going to be likely smaller, even considering periods of high volatility, like Christian was saying. If a stablecoin loses peg and rebounds, your loss is mitigated as long as you're not withdrawing from the pool. So I think from a stablecoin perspective, I don't want to say there's low risk. There's obviously risk in everything, but you're not likely to see wild changes to what you've deposited in a specific range.
It would seem to me that placing a small tick range for LPs would make more sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Uniswap v3 like stablecoin pools, that in general, most concentrated liquidity curves look like a normal curve, like a probability Gaussian curve, right? But for stablecoin ones, it's literally just like a line in the middle, because everyone obviously wants to trade at the $1 mark or whatever the peg is. So I mean, you're totally right? Like no one wants to trade outside of the $1 peg, because it's not going to happen. You're just not going to get any fees generated in that zone. Obviously you put a little bit buffer between $1 and like a few cents up and a few cents down, because it does fall between there. But I mean, like these stablecoin pools are generally more for like Pat said, switching your stablecoins quickly if you need them for some sort of protocol. Maybe like when the Silicon Valley Bank crisis happened, everyone wanted to get out of USDC as fast as possible because they were worried about it being of its depegging risk. So you saw like all these stablecoin pools like had a huge surge in activity because they were all rushing to move either into more volatile assets, which is kind of funny, like ETH, or they moved into USDT or some other form of stablecoin.
What should I, as an LP, be looking for? Should I be gauging risk based on other LPs? Should I be gauging risk based on external factors? I mean, I guess what are some of the most important things to look out for?
I mean, I think on the stablecoin side, having like a fundamental understanding of each of the different stablecoins mechanics are different because they're not all created equal. Some of those are obviously fiat backed. Some of them could be treasury backed. Some could be algorithmic. Some could be collateralized by crypto, which is more volatile. So I think that's obviously plays into how the peg is managed. I think that's important to understand in how you're managing risk in a stable coin pool, at least.
Yeah, and I think you could also look at how whale addresses are moving. So if there's a lot of whales, going into the pool, there's a lot of there's like more if whales are exiting a pool, right, there's like more chance for fee percentage, right, because your fees are a fraction of like how much of liquidity you provide. So if you can figure out like who the biggest providers are, right, you want to figure out like what percentage of the fee share you're going to get, which is a non-trivial task, but those are some things to look out for too.
Let's switch it to the wrap Bitcoin wet pool, aka the high liquidity pools. For LPs, what is an advantage of LPing into this type of pool versus a stablecoin pool?
Yeah, I mean, like for higher liquidity pools, I think it's an interesting problem because now, like you mentioned, right, the liquidity curve is no longer just a single like tick where everyone's trading. It's like a Gaussian curve. And so, liquidity providers now have to make a decision on like what ranges they want to provide liquidity for. And, it's not like they have to just pick one tick and then put all the liquidity into one, right? Like you actually define like a range at which you want your liquidity to trade at. And so I think for LPers, the general strategy is to look at what range the pair generally trades at. So if it's like USDC WETH, like WETH generally trades somewhere between like 1,800 and 2,600, right? So, the wider it is, I would say like, it's like spread out equally across like each, like if you put in like 1 ETH, I think that 1 ETH is traded like equally at each tick. So it's not like it's like 0.1 ETH at each tick. And so, you have to find the range that you're comfortable trading with. And, if you provide liquidity in ranges outside of the general curve, if the trading price ever gets to that, far-reaching part of the curve, you actually make a lot of money because you're the only one providing liquidity in that space, right? Of course, the odds of you getting there are like pretty low. So there's sort of this constant like efficiency, like risk analysis that you have to figure out like what range you want to trade in. And the idea behind Uniswap, right, is that it'll balance itself out, right? Like you'll have an efficient market where people are providing liquidity in the correct ranges because they know where to put it because that's where they make the most money.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think also another thing to look out for with these type of pools is your personal conviction. I think if you see Bitcoin continuing to rise while Ethereum may be flat or going down relative, then rebalancing your portfolio is another great way to reduce your impermanent loss, right? So capturing that impermanent loss that you might have at that point of time, rebalancing it to say, I think that now is the better time to enter this position.
Yeah.
And obviously adjusting the amounts that you LP would go a long way.
Yeah, we do. And I also think that one other thing that's important to keep it in mind, like when LPing in a crypto to crypto pool, is that you can expect the likelihood of impermanent loss to occur to be higher. Is now you have to kind of manage a position on both opinions on both sides of like what do you think ETH and Bitcoin's ratio will do, which will ultimately affect kind of like your impermanent loss exposure. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why you see a lot of the primary pools that people are trading against or providing liquidity to are like USDC token based. So USDC ETH, like USDC wrapped Bitcoin. There are some large token to token ones like wrapped Bitcoin to ETH, but I think you do see more token to stablecoin pools because now you only need to express your opinion where you want to provide liquidity more or less to one side.
Yeah, that's a great point too. It's also interesting to see that we have a lot more volume on the stablecoin to token trading pairs that we see on token trading pairs. So, I mean, that's a great point. When it comes to the higher volatility meme coins or altcoins positions, I think this is where things get much different compared to your, highly liquid tokens and your stablecoin pairs. Is that these pairs in price, they change very rapidly. And the price ratio, which is essentially your impermanent loss, your price ratio can fluctuate in any given minute, day, hour.
A lot of crypto data applications struggle really hard with handling low liquidity volumes, especially when it comes to swaps or, adding or removing liquidity. Because, a swap in V2 or V3 has this, you can use math to figure out the price of of a token versus with token A to token B. And so if you have this low liquidity pool where it's like USDC and I don't know, maybe Skibbity coin or something like that, right? Like who knows what the actual price is of USDC to Skibbity coin if the liquidity is at fractions of a penny, right? Because now you're doing math in the world where computers really struggle. It's really small, floating point decimal systems, and you can easily get into overflow territory. And so sometimes we end up in these situations where you see these token pools have one Skibbity coin is trillions of dollars of USD, right? Which just makes no sense. So it's not really a scam per se, but it is sort of a way these low liquidity pools kind of try to trick data providers to show look, our token is super popular because it's trading at such a high USDC to shitcoin value. And it's on us as data providers to make sure we're not telling incorrect things, because even though it might be true in theory, because it's not, because it's actually just a computer overflow error or some sort of technical implementation detail. And it's in this sort of world where price is determined exactly on chain, right? It can be very hard to figure out what the exact price is.
What are your thoughts around impermanent loss in terms of these tokens, or rather, how is it best as an LP to make a position in these pools? We saw with stablecoins, taking a small range is probably ideal, small tick range. With highly liquid pools, expanding that range and rebalancing is probably the best play there. Is there a different strategy to the highly volatile or the altcoin or the meme coin token pools?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, because you don't know what range they'll trade at, because who knows, Pepe was fractions of a penny one day, and the next day it was $1. I mean, that's not true, but some crazy growth like that, right? Especially within the first few days of a altcoin or meme coin being traded. I'd say in general, you want to expand your liquidity ticks as far as possible, and set generally a large range of liquidity. Even if you take a smaller slightly profit, right? You'd rather be confident that you're trading within the liquidity price, concentrated liquidity range, than not have your liquidity be used at all.
Well, thanks for tuning in. Christian, Pat, thanks again for joining us.